Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Monday, 29th of October, 2018. And it's an extremely fresh morning up here in the hills above Blackburn, Burnley, Accrington, Nelson, along this valley here in East Lancashire. And I think I'm far enough away not to be affected by whatever it is the CUADRILLA trigger today. And of course, this is becoming an absolute saga. I mean, I obviously feel for all the people in the Blackpool area on the peninsula, especially those, of course, who had designs on moving out of the area, which if you're in social housing is still a possibility. But if you own your own property, the likelihood of you being able to sell your property now is basically zero. So all the blagging that CUADRILLA have been doing over the last couple of years about how much they are bringing into Lancashire, I think it's time to start adding up how much they've actually taken out by the devaluation of property within that vicinity. And of course, it's not being helped, is it, Francis, by CUADRILLA's persistence in fracking, knowing full well that you will be triggering an increasing number of seismic events. And I have to say, if anybody hasn't seen Francis' interviews last week, and I'll put a link to one of them maybe under this video today, he doesn't look a well man. And I'd like to say I feel sorry for him, but of course, sadly, I don't. Because, it's now nearly 6 years ago since I met with Francis Egan at a public event on the outskirts of Blackpool. I believe it was in a caravan park there. And in the course of the discussion, of course, I did advise him that I'd booked 63 venues around the country to try to raise awareness of this insidious industry and to make sure that it never happened in the UK. And he assured me that it would go ahead and that in the UK it would be done very differently than anywhere else. Well, that's true, because in most other locations they don't trigger this kind of seismic activity on the first firing up of the pumps. Well, Francis, you and CUADRILLA are to fracking what MYXOMATOSIS is to rabbits, and you will have the same effect on the industry in this country, because it will get shut down as a result of the incompetence that pretty much everybody who was looking in on CUADRILLA knew would manifest. Only those who deceive themselves with arrogance and hubris could ever believe that CUADRILLA could perform this operation on the Fylde Peninsula without triggering seismic events. Look at what happened at Priest Hall now over 7.5 years ago. And funnily enough, the geology hasn't changed. It's still as susceptible to being messed with through fracking today as it was 7.5 years ago, and it'll be the same in another 7.5 years. So it really is time to pack up and go home. But of course, you've got the intellectual pygmy, Claire Perry, who is effectively acting as the body shield to Greg Clark. I mean, an absolutely inspired choice there, Greg. Somebody like Claire Perry, who craves the media attention and, fortunately has a total lack of capacity to remember what she said from 1 minute to the next, relying totally on the briefings of her advisors. Well, 23 seismic events in 11 days, including a couple of 0.8s. And, Francis Egan, in one of his interviews, was lamenting the fact. I mean, let's not forget that just a few weeks ago, Francis Egan stated that this operation could be done without triggering any seismic activity. Well, he's somewhat changed his tune now as the reality has kicked in, because it seems, Francis, that somebody actually forgot to tell the geology what you had said about the fracking operation. So Having said that it wouldn't trigger any seismic events, you've now triggered 23, including a couple of 0.8s, and now you're lamenting the fact that this country has set such low levels, i.e. 0.5, at which fracking should be halted, but only halted for the day, remember. You still get the opportunity to fire up the pumps the following day. But you were lamenting the fact that in Canada, the point at which fracking has to stop is when it triggers a 4.0. But let's, maybe put a couple of things in perspective here. First of all, Canada is a much larger landmass than England, and the population density of Canada is significantly less. Now, how much less? Well, the population density of Canada is 4 people per square mile. But the reality is the vast majority of people who live in Canada, a bit like in Scotland, where the vast majority live across the central belt, the vast majority of people who live in Canada live within a belt that runs about 100 kilometers or so north of the US border. Once you get further north than that, it's pretty much a wilderness. But even so, even taking into account the densely populated belt, the population density of Canada is 4 people per square kilometre. So, have a guess what the population density of England is. Well, it's 400. So it's 400 people per square kilometre. So exactly 100 times that of Canada. So what relevance does making the statement that Canada has a limit of 4.0 and therefore you think the same should be applied in the UK? Only a delusional sociopath could even consider making such an observation. But there again, it was made by Francis Egan, so why are we not surprised? So the bottom line is that it doesn't take a rocket scientist, does it, Francis, to work out that basically you are going to trigger seismic events every time you fire up those pumps. And you're not exactly being transparent at the moment as to when they're being fired up, for how long, and at what pressure. Because, call it a hunch, but I don't believe that you have yet got anywhere near the 7,500 to 9,500 psi that you talk about as the pressure in your frack plan. And if you were to proceed and complete the 45 stages that you have put into the frack plan, then the cumulative impact is going to be very, very significant. And, it's just a case of how long before an event is triggered that actually brings this industry to its knees. And even the likes of numbnuts Claire Perry actually acknowledging that it would be damaging to her political future. I'm not sure she even has the competence to actually come to that conclusion herself. Maybe somebody will actually have to sit her down and tell her that, it's game over. And of course, all of the other companies like iGas and INEOS, watching very closely, and probably their head very much in their hands as they just wonder how the hell an incompetent like Francis Egan was ever appointed into that position. Well, if it's any consolation, Francis, I don't think it really matters who was put into that job. And, basically you are walking away with some £3 million plus in compensation and benefits since you were appointed into that job. And, as I made the observation at the weekend, this time next year, you probably will be a millionaire because of the usual practice of paying failed CEOs somewhat outrageous severance packages. So, you can ride off into the sunset, but, your name, Francis Egan, just like John Dewar of Third Energy, will always be associated with the abject failure. And you can't say you weren't warned, because a significant percentage of the population have been trying to get you to realise that this had no possibility of succeeding in this country right from the get-go. So it's a case of watch this space. I know that there will be probably more people logging on to the British Geological Survey website today than maybe at any time in its history. And, I've had a punt. 50 quid says that a 3.0 is triggered by CUADRILLA before the year end. And if that doesn't bring this industry to a halt, then you know fine well that the corporate globalists, the sociopaths, really don't care about you, and even the illusion that they have some concern about the impact on communities will just evaporate. And last Thursday I did a truncated episode of Fracking Nightmare because my voice was really struggling last week. So if you haven't seen episode 120, which is on YouTube, it's also on Facebook, do take a look, because I made reference to the phenomenal devastation that has occurred up in the northeast of the Netherlands around the Groningen gas field. Now, some people are trying to liken what's occurred in Groningen to the UK, but the reality is this. What's occurred in Groningen was a conventional gas field. It's a gas field that's been exploited since the late 1960s. But the cumulative impact is such that the massive seismic activity that has been experienced in that area has only really occurred in the last decade. So there is phenomenal property damage in the Groningen area, and the Dutch government have stated that they will attempt to cease production from that gas field within the next few years, accepting that basically there's likely to be more significant damage in the meantime. So this is the issue. The cumulative impact is potentially something that is far beyond anything that anybody wants to even begin to think about, or certainly not mention. So even if the limits of seismic activity are raised, which there's no doubt Claire Perry is going to try and move for, if the limits are raised, and even if it just triggers, but even if it triggers seismic activity in the sort of 2.5 to 3.5 range, then the cumulative impact is ultimately going to come home to roost. And whether it's 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the way, then basically the full implications of this industry will be felt. And frankly, all those who have been involved in this must be held to account. They must be put on notice of liability, because there is absolutely no excuse whatsoever for claiming that you didn't know or you didn't think this could ever happen. So watch this space. I really think that we are in the last few months of any pretense that there is any viability of unconventional hydrocarbon exploitation in the UK. And although right now the focus is in the north, let's not forget the south, because although the south isn't being targeted in quite the same way, nonetheless, Newdigate, south of Dorking, is the earthquake centre in the south. And what was previously a geologically stable area has now had, I think it's some 14 seismic events since April the 1st. And what's changed there? Well, the unconventional hydrocarbon activity at Brockham, to the east of Dorking, north of Newdigate, and at Horse Hill, just a little bit south of Newdigate. So the reality is that the most significant increase in seismic activity in the UK since April the 1st has been in areas that are being targeted for unconventional hydrocarbon exploitation. So let's wake up and get this shut down. So this has to be pressure from everywhere, and obviously I would also encourage people. I was speaking to Helen Junso last night, and also my good friend Benjamin Dean. And, both of these researchers have been somewhat frustrated that the detail of the frack plan does not seem to be in the consciousness of many of the people who live in that area. So, the onus, just as everywhere else, is very much on the local community to really bring the pressure to bear to get this shut down. And I would encourage as many people as possible in the filed area to download that frack plan and take a look, because what you'll see in there is that when that frack plan was produced, which I believe was around about March or April of this year, there is actually the observation that they expect to be able to keep fracking until the seismic activity gets above 3. And I think if that had been more commonly known over the last few months, then there might have been a little bit more cohesion within the opposition within the Blackpool area. Well, meanwhile, of course, IGAS are still thinking that they're going to be able to progress with their activity at Tinker Lane and Miston Springs in North Nottinghamshire. And I have to say, it's very pleasing to see that there is continued opposition in these areas. And I have to say that, even as a named defendant on the injunctions, I think it's time to make it very, very clear to the corporations, to the judiciary, and to the politicians that the general public will not be ridden roughshod over, and that these corporate injunctions, which establish a raft of legislation beyond parliamentary law, will not be tolerated, and therefore are not worth the paper that they are written on. And I will obviously get the opportunity to challenge that when I'm back in the London courts versus IGAS in early December, but more of that nearer the time. Meanwhile, it's a very fresh morning, and I'm very grateful that my studio audience has left me in peace here while I do this broadcast. And it's also a timely reminder that we're reaching that time of year when I need to keep a pair of gloves in my pocket. So have a great day. Hopefully the earth doesn't move for you today, but if CUADRILLA fire up the frack pumps, then I'm pretty sure if you're in the Blackpool area, it will. Catch you on Wednesday morning at 8:30. See you then.